One spiritual concept that I've been asked a lot about in my years of teaching, and that people seem to be really conflicted about, is non-attachment. It comes up a lot in spiritual texts and is often a really central, important theme, but it really seems to cause a lot of confusion and misunderstanding. So today I want to explore this teaching of non-attachment, clarify what it really does mean, and explain why it absolutely doesn't mean becoming really cold and aloof or not loving and caring for the people around you. So for those who are new here, I'm Catherine, and on this channel I share the insights that have arisen from 30 years of spiritual practice, including 15 years living in an ashram in the Himalayas. And I try to explain some of the deepest spiritual concepts in a clear and accessible way in these videos. So in Sanskrit, the word for non-attachment is Vairagya. It can also be translated as detachment or dispassion, and it appears again and again in the teachings of Advaita Vedanta and yoga philosophy. And yet something about this teaching can make people feel really uncomfortable. So let's look at why this is the case. It's easy to see that attachment causes suffering. I'm sure there have been times in your own life when you've either feared losing or grieved over having lost something or someone that you've really cared about. Or when you've been deeply disappointed that life hasn't turned out in the way that you hoped it would. But although you don't want to suffer, detachment to some people sounds even less appealing. They think, I don't want to stop caring for the people I love, or stop feeling passionate about the things that matter to me, or become indifferent to the suffering in the world. Or I don't want to stop enjoying beautiful things and having meaningful relationships and being creative. But this sense comes because they imagine that non-attachment means becoming disinterested and passive and cut off from the things that they currently love. I think this is partly because the mind often assumes that being attached to and caring for are essentially the same thing. So it thinks that if attachment weakens, then loving and caring must also weaken. But the truth is that this is a misconception. The scriptures absolutely aren't encouraging us to care less, but they're revealing how we can care more freely. The misunderstanding also arises because people think that attachment is an indication of there being a deep connection. But as I'll be explaining a bit later in the video, when we actually examine what's going on here, we can see that attachment actually only arises due to a sense of separateness. And as that sense of separation begins to dissolve, as a sense of oneness unfolds, genuine unconditional love actually becomes much more available, not less. But first of all, let's look at what actually does need detaching from and what that means. You might have picked up the idea that scriptural teachings encourage detachment from the body, for example. But what does that really mean? It clearly doesn't mean neglecting the body or pretending it doesn't matter. In fact, many of these traditions contain detailed guidance about how to care for the body properly, how to keep it clean, nourish it, exercise it, how to maintain good health. So what's being called into question here isn't the body itself. What's being questioned is the assumption that this body is what I fundamentally am. In other words, the detachment being encouraged isn't detachment from the body itself, but detachment from the ego mind's mistaken identification with the body. And when that identification begins to weaken, we still experience the body and mind as before. It's just that we no longer feel trapped within their limitations. We begin to recognize that our existence isn't dependent on the body, and that our essential nature is something far more fundamental than the constantly changing experiences of the body. And so as that understanding deepens, much of the fear and anxiety and fixation that comes from identifying as a separate individual begins to dissolve. So now let's look at what's actually meant by having non-attachment to those who are dear to us. At the beginning of the Bhagavad Gita, Arjun's having an emotional breakdown because he's about to go into battle against his ruthless cousin Duryodhana. He sees many other friends and relatives facing him from Duryodhana's side of the battlefield, and he becomes grief-stricken at the thought of killing these people, and fear-stricken when he thinks about the karmic consequences of his doing so. So in the midst of the battlefield, he asks Krishna for guidance. In the story of the Mahabharata, which the Gita is a part of, Krishna and Arjuna and his brothers, the Pandavas, had already exhausted every peaceful option. They'd accepted exile, they had been prepared to massively compromise and give Duryodhana almost everything they owned. But Duryodhana would accept nothing less than total domination. So Arjuna found himself facing a battle that he never would have chosen, yet one that could no longer be avoided. So Arjuna represents everything that's good and righteous and fair in this battle, because sometimes those things do actually have to be defended. But in this moment, his attachment to these people and to his beliefs about karma cause him to become completely dysfunctional, and he's just on the verge of completely surrendering. So the 18 chapters of the Bhagavad Gita are the teachings that Krishna gives Arjuna at this crisis point in his life. And if you're not very familiar with the Gita, I've written a booklet called 9 Key Gita Verses, which includes some of the central teachings of the text, including what this battle really symbolizes. And you'll find a link to download that for free in the description box below. So one of the main themes running through the Gita is detachment. Krishna tells Arjuna to stand up and fight, but be detached from the fruits of your actions, and be detached from the sensations of pleasure and pain, heat and cold, like and dislike that arise. But although Krishna is telling Arjuna to be detached, the fact that he's telling him to fight indicates that he isn't saying that Arjuna shouldn't care about the world around him, but rather that he should cultivate the strength and freedom to act for the good of the whole, and to stand up against ignorance and not be overwhelmed by emotion or swayed according to his own personal preferences. So when we look at many of the verses on non-attachment in the Gita, what Krishna is really describing is freedom from the emotional turbulence created by attachment and aversion, by rag and dvesh. This freedom is precisely what's being pointed to by the word Vairagya. It means freedom from the push and pull of grasping after what we want and resisting what we don't want. And speaking from my own experience, I'd say having Vairagya makes caring for those around us so much easier and less emotionally complicated when attachment and aversion aren't involved. There's still the same wish for their well-being, but much less of the frustration and resentment and sense of burden that shows up when care becomes mixed up with attachment and expectations and the feelings that people should behave as I want them to and the world should unfold according to my preferences. And what remains when those expectations fade away is a far greater sense of freedom. And that freedom allows love and patience to flow much more naturally than before. So it's really important to understand that this freedom doesn't mean becoming emotionally numb. It simply means that we don't cling to pleasant experiences or become frightened of unpleasant ones. This is why Krishna says that a wise person meets both pleasure and pain with equanimity. It means that person allows those sensations to arise and be known and dissolve without that sense of push or pull. So then we've looked at how non-attachment doesn't mean not caring or not feeling. Let's look at how being attached to someone also isn't the same as just loving them. Let's say someone thinks, I love my partner. That's beautiful. When we say we love someone, there's usually genuine affection and care present. But often mixed in with that are also all sorts of expectations, fears, and dependencies. We need them to understand us, to behave in a certain way, and continue playing a particular role in our lives. And as long as we need those things, an underlying fear comes along with it. Because what if they change? What if they leave? What if they die? That suffering isn't being created by love itself. It's being created by the attached mind's insistence that events should unfold according to its preferences. And this same pattern appears everywhere. We become attached to our health, to our reputation, our plans, our possessions, our achievements, even our spiritual progress. Yet everything in life is constantly changing. Bodies change, relationships change, circumstances change. So Vairagya happens when we stop demanding that life remain fixed in order for us to be at peace. That doesn't mean that our preferences disappear. A detached person can still prefer health to illness, harmony to conflict, sunshine to rain. The difference is that they know that they're intrinsically peaceful and free. So they're no longer dependent on certain preferences being met in order to feel okay. They enjoy the sunshine when it appears, but then they adapt when it doesn't. And that's a freedom which attachment never quite allows. But from the perspective of Advaita Vedanta, non-duality, the deepest understanding of Vairagya takes us even further than this. As I've been saying, many people assume that the opposite of attachment is indifference, withdrawal, or separateness, distance. But when we examine attachment carefully, we come to see that it's actually only possible to be attached once there is already a sense of separation. If you think about it, you'll see that before there can be a sense of attachment, there has to be a sense of being somebody, me, who feels separate and incomplete, and then another person or thing or situation which appears to be capable of completing me, and without which this me would be incomplete. So the illusion of separation comes first, and attachment is the consequence. And so these teachings are actually intended to dissolve that sense of separation that gives rise to attachment in the first place. In fact, the whole purpose of the teachings of yoga and Advaita Vedanta is to dissolve this sense that there's a separate me here and a separate world out there, and to uncover the truth that there's only one pure consciousness appearing as all of these countless different forms. This is why the Bhagavad Gita describes the realized person as seeing the self in all beings and all beings in the self. The appearance of difference remains. You still see different people, different personalities, different situations, but there's a recognition that they're all just appearances in one pure, undivided consciousness. And when this understanding begins to deepen and be experienced directly, something really beautiful starts to happen. Love doesn't disappear as people fear it might. Rather, the previous boundaries around love begin to dissolve. The old division between me here and my life and you over there and your life disappears. The sense of there being the people I love and everybody else becomes much less convincing. You see everyone as your very own self. So you no longer need social or moral rules to remind you to be kind or to care, because caring flows naturally after this realization. After all, if the other person is just your very own self appearing in a different form, why would you not wish them well? Why would you knowingly harm them, or not help to alleviate their suffering when that's possible? But of course, recognizing suffering and responding to it doesn't mean that your own body and mind needs to suffer as well. And this is another area where attachment and love can be confused. Sometimes people imagine that the depth of their caring can be measured by the amount of distress they feel. They almost feel guilty about feeling peaceful when confronted with the suffering of others, as if peace somehow proves that they don't care enough. But if a friend is struggling, what's actually the most helpful? That we become overwhelmed alongside them? or that we remain clear enough to offer whatever support or encouragement or practical help that's available. So these teachings aren't encouraging indifference to suffering, but freedom from unnecessary suffering. The more established we are in peace, the more available we become to life, and the more capable we are of responding wisely when suffering appears. If your right hand becomes injured, your left hand immediately comes to help. It doesn't stop to calculate whether assistance is deserved or need gratitude. It doesn't wonder whether helping is in its own best interests. It simply responds because both hands belong to the same body. The vision of oneness works in just the same way. So being detached doesn't mean loving less or caring less. It means loving more openly and more purely. It means embodying a love that isn't confined by possessiveness or dependency. And this is actually why Vairagya becomes increasingly natural as spiritual understanding deepens. Because as long as fulfillment is being sought in changing things, a clinging kind of attachment will always follow. Because the mind knows that whatever's gained can also be lost. But when the wholeness that's already present as the self is recognized, many attachments just loosen naturally. Not because life has lost its beauty or because there's anything wrong with experiencing pleasure. It's simply that something far deeper and more valuable has been discovered. And this is why it actually doesn't work to try to force detachment or non-attachment. There's an old story in Aesop's fable about the sun and the wind arguing about which is stronger. They have a competition about who can get a man to remove his cloak. But the harder the wind blows, the more tightly the traveller holds onto it. But when the sun shines warmly, he removes it voluntarily. In just the same way, detachment really can't be forced. When we try to manufacture it through willpower, the mind will often cling even harder. But as inner contentment grows, attachment naturally loosens by itself. So repeatedly bringing our attention to the peace and bliss of our own nature and dissolving the sense of separateness is by far the best way to cultivate non-attachment. Then life can still be enjoyed, relationships cherished, beauty appreciated, but from a place of oneness and freedom rather than of desperate need. So perhaps you can see now why these ancient teachings place such importance on Vairagya. Non-attachment doesn't make us love less. It just removes the things that become mixed in with love. The possessiveness, the dependency, the fear of loss, and the need to control. And as the illusion of separation begins to dissolve, what remains is a love that's freer, that's more expansive and more natural. It's a love that doesn't depend on any particular outcome and that sees itself everywhere in everything. And this is why the opposite of attachment isn't indifference at all. The opposite of attachment is oneness.